A CBC color presentation.
I've been wanting to ask you, Glenn, what are the earliest recollections that you have of hearing the music of Bach?
My own performances, I'm not sure. No, I wasn't all that precocious. It's simply that I wasn't much attracted to multi-voiced things until I was a teenager. I was definitely homophonically inclined until the age of about 10. And then I suddenly got the message. And Bach began to emerge into my world and has never altogether left it. Of course, one of the great moments of my life, and it was not with a Bach fugue, but it was with a fugue, and its relevance is entirely fugal, was when I was exposed to my own performance of the Mozart Fugue Koelschel 394, the C major one, the which is a wonderful academic study in how to write a fugue and obey the textbook and never quite get it off the ground, but I do like it. And I was learning it. I was early teenager, I don't remember exactly how old. And suddenly a vacuum cleaner was struck up beside the piano, and I couldn't quite hear myself play. I was having a feud with the housekeeper at this particular time, and it was done on purpose. But I couldn't quite hear myself. I began to feel what I was doing, the whole tactile presence of that fugue as was represented by finger positions, and is represented also by the kind of sound that you might get if you stood in the bathtub and in a shower and shook your head, you know, with water coming out of both ears. And it was the most luminously exciting thing you can imagine, the most glorious sound. It took off all of the things Mozart didn't quite manage to do, I was doing for him, and I suddenly realized that that particular screen through which I was viewing this and which I had erected between myself and Mozart and his fugue was exactly what I needed to do, and exactly why, as I later understood, a certain mechanical process could indeed come between, you know, myself and the work of art that I was involved with.
You know, as a sometime composer, I think it's fair to say of all composers that they want the audience to hear absolutely every note they write, and one of the frustrations for the listener and not always being able to discriminate every note that the composer has written. And as a performer, I wonder how you find yourself approaching the music of Bach, which is the subject of this program, in order to try to make every single one of the notes heard.
I think one approaches it in so many different ways, perhaps depending on the time of life in which that approach finds you, your moods of the time, the audio perspectives that are available to you, the audio perspectives that are available to other people and that influence you. It's very difficult to make all of those things, all of those incredibly complicated statements of Bach available. I think it's impossible to do it by any other means than through the phonograph and through the recording. I don't think that one can ever do it, ever hope to do it in a concert hall at all, because the acoustics are unrealistic. One just doesn't have enough after the fact or with the fact control of your performance, of what you're doing at that time.
I assume for that reason that the introduction of stereo has meant a lot, and the introduction of even more channels could mean more to this separation, this ability to realize all the notes.
I could. I had a fascinating experience a couple of weeks ago. I sat in a studio in New York and took a couple of Bach fugues, the E major fugue from the second volume of the 48 and the F sharp minor fugue from the same book, and also the B flat minor from that book. And these are fugues that I've played all my life. I'm very familiar with them. I can't quite say I could do them in my sleep, but I think almost that, because they were favorite pieces when I was a teenager. And I had almost the performing experience of a lifetime, I would say. I put on a set of earphones and had fed to me my own click track, which in this case consisted of simply saying 4, 3, 2, 1, and the constituted the beat. Whereupon I went back to the bass voice and started playing the bass voice along with my controlled performance, hearing only what I had just done and hearing really a muffled version, as one must necessarily do with earphones, of what I was in fact doing. And having put down the bass voice in this fashion, we did the tenor and the alto and the soprano and so on. And the extraordinary thing was that having known these pieces 20 years perhaps, 20 years conservatively indeed, I saw them and heard them afresh in the most extraordinary way. I had never realized things about the inner voice aspects of those fugues, which are manifestly clear. They're simply there to be apprehended by anyone who takes a close look at that score. And I'm sure that if you took a student, or indeed anyone who was at all interested in music and suspicious of the contrapuntal experience, because a lot of people are, if you took him into a studio and had him do precisely that, let him listen to one voice at a time, which I really think is the ideal way to understand music in any case. It leads to other questions as to whether one can be content with that on a larger scale of experienced music. I'm sure that it would change his whole notion of what Bach was, what the Baroque represented, what that whole incredibly involved experiment of Baroque counterpoint really meant.
Do you foresee at some point presenting that experience to the public in the form of a recording?
I would like to try. It isn't quite feasible yet. It isn't feasible in my own case until I learn to play duets and trios and quartets with myself successfully, which I certainly did not do on this occasion. It was a disaster as an ensemble performance. But I would love to see performances of that kind presented in four-corner stereo, a speaker in each corner of the room. It would be a totally unreal performance. One would not in any sense be confronted with the spectacle or the sense or the awareness of somebody up there on that podium, on that platform, playing at you. You would be in the center of the problem, so to speak. And I think that's really what, the listener should try to do, and the way in which performance experiment with Bach must continue and must try to bring the listener into the center of the problem.
When you successfully solve that problem for yourself, I can see a hotel cocktail lounge advertising featuring the Glenn Gould Quartet.
But you mentioned the Muzak-like, hotel lobby, hotel dining room, whatever, connection of Bach or any music manufactured that way. There is a real Muzak-like significance in the nature of fugue itself, in the nature of any music that involves the kind of live a life of its own on behalf of each voice that the fugue really does. Because the prime function of a fugue is to suggest an experience that is essentially open-ended. I'd like to think that one could dip in and dip out of an experience of music just as easily as you get into an elevator and are with a bit of Mantovani for 35 seconds and you get to the 19th floor, at which point you move into the Peter Nero zone, you know, and get somebody else's wall-to-wall musical decoration. I think that in a sense this is what Bach was about, because obviously he was quite ready to accept all forms of interchangeability as between, you know, different performing forces, as between keys.
This is certainly true of the C-sharp major, which was originally a C major fugue running some 19 bars, only in this version in C-sharp major it now runs 35. So obviously Bach himself could be of two minds about how long the fugue could be and how many episodes to throw into it, and whether it should have a terminal point after 19 bars or after 35 bars.
Yeah. Did it change at all as between its incarnations in C and C-sharp? Because I didn't know.
Yes, the theme, the thematic materials, and a good many of the details are the same, but in the version that is in Book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier, it's very much expanded. And this points up, however, I mean, since he appears to have redone it and expanded it and put it into C-sharp, primarily in order to have it occupy an appropriate point in the Well-Tempered Clavier key scheme. And there had to be a piece in C-sharp, just as there had to be a piece in C. Well, he didn't happen to have a piece in C-sharp, and he did have one in C, and simply moved it up to C-sharp, but in the process expanded it considerably.
This must have been much less important to him, even though he set out quite conspicuously to write preludes and fugues in every key, than to Scriabin or even to Chopin, who had theories about keys and what they meant, and which were languorous and which were brisk and which were bright and which forced pure thoughts upon the imagination and which were lascivious and so on. Obviously Bach didn't have this. If he could transfer from C, which is a pure and an upstanding and an academic and a solid citizen key, to C-sharp, which is a slightly dirty old man key, you know, if he could really do that, then obviously he wasn't much concerned with the Scriabinesque theories of key.
In Bach's time, and in practically all of the music up until the beginning of this century, you were not usually expected to be able to hear and discriminate at one time more than 3 tones sounding simultaneously, or at the very most 4, and in a fairly regularized series of relationships. Now in the 20th century, we have to be able to discriminate 5 or 6 or 7 simultaneously sounding tones, and in an entirely new relationship. And I suspect this is one of the reasons that composers at this point are so far ahead of the public.
It's very true. Of course, the whole idea of what music is, of what music can consist, has changed so much in the last 5 years. I feel something quite remarkable happening, and I'm pleased to see it happening in a way, because I think that we come by a very hidebound notion of what music in fact was. I think that that much of the new music has a lot to do, and I don't mean to sound like that chap Marshall something or other, has a lot to do with the spoken word, with the rhythms and the patterns and the rise and the fall and the inclination of the spoken word and the human voice. I work a lot with the spoken word because I've been doing, as you know, radio documentaries, and it has occurred to me in the last few years that it's entirely unrealistic to see that particular kind of work, that particular ordering of phrase and regulation of cadence, which one is able to do, taking, let us say, the subject of an interview like this one to a studio after the fact and chopping it up and splicing here and there and pulling on this phrase and accentuating that one, throwing some reverb in there and adding a compressor here and a filter there. That it's unrealistic to think of that as anything but composition, that it really is, in fact, composition. I think our whole notion of what music is has forever merged with all the sounds that are around us, you know, everything that the environment makes available. And in that sense, I think that the contrapuntalists, especially the Renaissance contrapuntalists, and Bach as he represented them historically, in a sense, were the first practical men as composers. They were the first people who recognized that it was possible and feasible and realistic to expect the human mind and the human ear to be aware of many simultaneous relationships, to follow their diverse courses and to be involved in all of them. Not to expect a particular precedence accorded to any one of them, not to expect any bowing and scraping on the part of the 2 or 3 remaining voices to the one that was uppermost or lowermost or canto firmest most or whatever. And I think these were the first realistic people in the sense that they understood some aspects, at least, of this, environmental comfort, which was to become music, and which is now, perhaps for the first time, truly becoming music. I don't know whether you believe in that, but
Yes, I do believe in it. As a matter of fact, the complete independence of each of the voices in a Bach work, practically any Bach work, I think, is one of the most strikingly modern aspects of the way his musical mind operates to me. But it has struck me more than once when listening to Bach that some of this freedom of the separate voices that seems so modern now may come out of his admiration for the music of the French and Italian composers of 100 years before his time. I mean, people like Monteverdi or Lassus. The kind of vocal writing that we associate with motets and madrigals of the period, which we even get in barbershop quartet writing, shows up again and again in Bach. In fact, the E major fugue, which you picked for this program, has always had for me a 16th or 17th century kind of sound about it, almost as if it were simply a transcription of one of those pieces for four human voices that he knew so well, or maybe one of those great Venetian pieces for brasses like Gabrielli. And incidentally, the prelude that goes with the E major, on the other hand, has something of Vivaldi in it for me, which is still another part of the 17th century territory. Some musicians have called the well-tempered the ABCs for every practicing musician, and I think I'd rather call it the alpha and omega, or maybe the ABs, because of the regular pairing of every fugue with its prelude, but also because in all it seems such a marvelous compendium of everything in music that had happened up to Bach's time, everything that he knew, especially the E major, which does seem to me to hark back so clearly to the time of Bach's grandfather.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the B-flat minor is a good deal more contemporary in outlook, really. In a certain sense, it's almost like a sonata, because every time that he does something adventurous with his chief motive, every time he turns it upside down or puts it in a round-like form in a canon or whatever, every time he turns the upside-down form, the inverted form, into, a canonic shape, he gives it a whole new harmonic field to play in. The first time he uses the inverted canon, he also returns to his opening key, B-flat minor, and, that's a very sonata-like notion. It's a very recapitulatory sort of notion, and a very advanced notion, especially in relation to all those people who claim that he was just an old polyphonic fogey. And the first time he puts the inverted form with the original version of the theme, he stakes out a whole new harmonic territory, A-flat major, which he's not touched before. It's not unlike the sort of procedure that a classical sonata, whatever writer, would have used to telegraph the coda that was about to come, the ending that was just ahead, sort of thing. But one of the funny things to me is that many historians speculate that the piano sonata, the violin sonata, the string quartet, the symphony, was a great miracle of art, that somehow in the later years of the 18th century, something congealed, and all of the proper architectural impulses that had been abroad in the day in house design and in furniture design and all such things got into music, and a certain kind of welcome symmetry resulted, and that this was indeed one of the great miracles of art, and that, as we know, the reputations of composers like Bach had to be eclipsed temporarily. But to me, the great wonder of the classical sonata is not that it was invented, in the sense that it took a long time to be arrived at, but that anyone ever really wanted to bother doing it. Because I don't see why it was ever regarded as a great advance of art that an incredibly autocratic principle sprang into being, whereby if you wrote an ideal sonata, and you could, the conservatories were full of them in those days. Bizet wrote an ideal symphony, in the French fashion, and at the age of 17 or whatever it was. That if you wrote an ideal sonata, you did things according to a certain kind of prescription that was fail-safe. Because once you had assumed that so many things went into the prescription of what a symphony was and what a concerto was, once you'd assumed that the first theme ought to be upright and powerful and brisk and delineated clearly, and the second theme should be less forceful and more lyrical and more relaxed and more tranquilo and more midnight-colored and so on. Once you'd assumed those things, and you'd done all those things, you could then take your symphony or your prospective string quartet or sonata, whatever it was, they were all the same really, to your teacher and say, here is my symphony, sir, and I have done all these things, and as you will see, my first theme is impeccably a Mannheim skyrocket, bom, 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 and my second theme is yam, da 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 da, and is marvelously lyrical, and he'll say, aha, my boy, but you see, it is not quite tasteful, because this second theme, it comes too late. No, it comes too... Well, some would say it comes too early, but no, I think it comes too late. It is... how shall I say? You see, it is something which only a great master, which you are not yet, my boy, could arrive at. Now, I mean, this attitude toward what taste was and the role that taste played, you know, just simply got in the way, I think, in the later 18th century and certainly in the 19th century. Whereas one of the great refreshing things about the Baroque is that taste really didn't play a very strong part. The very fact that you can dip in and out of the Bach experience, that you can satisfactorily merge one fugue with another and play half a dozen or play 24 at once or play one only or play half of one only and be equally satisfied and not feel that you've missed out on something is the greatest argument against that kind of imposed taste, which always had to do with dimension of experience, always had to do with what the middle point was in relation to the end. Because in Bach, you just don't get that notion of taste as revealed through dimension. For instance, if I were to make an experiment and take X number of fugues, but only a portion of each of those selected, and make a compote out of it, put them together, adjoin them with good taste at, proper splicing points, and so on, and make one massive contrapuntal structure out of that lively collection. Would you, in effect, as a listener, be disturbed by the lack of taste, not only of my doing this, but of the kind of decision that I would have to be authorized to make, in order to make them adjacent one to the other, instead of leaving them as separate and bound pieces of music, for your perception? Would you personally be offended by that?
Well, I don't know whether it's fair to say offended. I think rather I'd be flabbergasted, because it seems to me probable that you would, while I can very well see that you can take these like so many bits of audio tape and cut them all up and splice them back together in a form that will suit you, that you will encounter some evidences of musical illogic. I would not be offended any more than I'm offended by what Bach does to Vivaldi. You have perfect freedom to do what you want with Bach's music, as Bach felt he had perfect freedom to do what he wanted with Vivaldi's. If, however, you have exercised ghastly good taste, if you have done it, if you've done your homework properly, the result will be persuasive.
But doesn't it strike you as humanly good that the element of taste should be, ruled out of a listening experience? I mean, if we are going to absorb an environment, sorry to sound like Marshall Ellis again, but if we're to do that, then surely the question of taste is, in a certain sense, irrelevant, because your notion of the environment in which you must live and work and think and do your very best cogitating is not going to be mine, because your cogitating is necessarily going to be about different things and have a different past and be moving toward a different sort of future. And is it realistic to think that one autocratically imposed, terminal-bound statement can satisfy both of us equally? Is it not possible to think that that could only be done through a notion in which the form itself applicable to that work didn't have a terminus, didn't come to an end, didn't recognize that kind of boundary? The thing about Bach, if you think about in religious terms or in church-like terms, in theological terms, I suppose, the thing about Bach is that unlike all of the sonata writers, unlike all of the symphony makers and the string quartet writers, he didn't have the urge. I won't say he didn't possess the tools, because I think you as a composer know very well that he did possess the tools, incredibly so. But he didn't have the urge to demythologize his material within any given work. I mean, the notion of the sonata and the symphony is precisely that, really, if you put it in theological terms, that the composer had such ultimate power over the material, over all the decisions that went into the material, and or his characters as represented by material, if you see voices as characters in that sense, as a transformation of vocal impulse into characterization, that he could, if he chose, by textual alterations, by changes of pace, by all of the things with which a sonata or a symphony could be disrupted and the events, the whole course of events changed, he could, in a sense, demythologize his characters. He could actually make one feel a sense of metamorphosis, a sense of implicit plot context in relation to what he was doing. So there was a very aggressive attitude abroad in the world of the symphony and the sonata, basically. And if you think about it, the sonata and symphony writers who are heroes are not unlike generals, they're not unlike the Napoleon figures. Beethoven's very like Napoleon, really. He is that great hero general who commanded all the Mannheim leitmotifs and held it all together. I love Beethoven's music, as you know, so that has nothing to do with it. But nevertheless, there was a very aggressive impulse, whereas in Bach's case, it was a kind of mystic acquiescence before something that was absolutely inevitable and which, once started, could not be stopped.
In talking about the nature of the fugue and the experience of the fugue, it has seemed to me that there are times in which you can think of the fugue simply as a dialogue, and the changing character of the fugue is very much like the differences in the kinds of things we elect to talk about, depending upon the circumstance in which we find ourselves, whether or not it's a dialogue at the edge of a lake, or a dialogue at a cocktail party, or a dialogue on the corner of 42nd Street or some other crowded city, a dialogue in bed. Almost inevitably, the nature of the environment in which you find yourself is going to affect the kind of dialogue in which you engage.
Well, do you have pictorial associations of any particular kind with a fugue, or with fugues in general, with contrapuntal music as opposed to homophonic music?
I have almost no pictorial associations with music at all. That may seem strange.
No.
Strange particularly in a society in which so much of musical education insists that there must be pictorial associations, to the point where, I mean, you refer to the sonata form and wondering why musicians ever found it necessary to invent it. I often wonder what made it necessary for composers to invent tone painting, or the tone poem, as it's come to be called, where these pictorial associations are forced upon you.
But are there conventional images that are associated with counterpoint? Because one thinks of certain kinds of music as leading on to imagery. One thinks of, my goodness, what the Strauss tone poems as having to do primarily with, at least I do, with colors, perhaps, with violent colors much of the time. But are there images that many people associate with counterpoint, do you think? Presumably there could be a generation growing up that has learned to correlate a contrapuntal experience with a certain kind of visual image. What would it be? Something very inner and post-expressionist, sort of Rorschach blot?
I think there are probably as many possible pictorial associations with, let's say, a Bach fugue, which does not contain anything that could possibly be remotely associated with the visual, other than by a kind of literal Mickey Mouse effect. When the notes go up, you think of clouds, and when the notes go down, you think of grottos. But leaving aside that kind of literalness, it would probably take someone who had a very strong visual sense already, let's say a filmmaker like Norman McLaren, might make direct visual associations with a Bach fugue that wouldn't occur to either of us.
Well, there is, I suppose, an animation-like aspect to Bach as regards his performance anyway, because one can certainly think of it as existing at an infinite number of tempi, as being taken frame by frame, separate, fragmented, and valued for that individual frame.
It feels that way looking at it from the point of view of its composition. It feels rather like having to put the piece together note by note by note, one at a time, to get each one exactly right and exactly in its right place, just the way you would put together animation cells to be able to ultimately simulate emotion, which by the time it arrives in the form of emotion projected as a film has to seem completely natural and flowing and appropriate to the character that you're trying to portray. And yet, in its technical execution, it has only been put together very, very slowly, piece by piece, painstakingly, and none of that must ever be apparent.
Do you think that film observation, I mean the whole cult of film, which is the new great super art, the art that Wagner thought he was inventing, do you think that filmmaking is going to influence the way in which we listen to music?
Yeah, it may very well be that what film will ultimately do is to change both our ears and our eyes. I mean, the ability of the eye to lead the ear and the ear to lead the eye is something that film is exploring more and more by offsetting the track, by leading your ear into the next scene before you have visually left the preceding scene, or doing the reverse, introducing visually something that is about to happen while the track continues to hold on something that you have just been leaving. And in that sense, it's a construction which is not all that unrelated to the principles of counterpoint.
Right. have a feeling that it's changed our sense of distance that sound represents. And I know that since film became more and more important to me in the last decade or so, I've begun to think of music dimensionally in a way that just hadn't occurred before. You see, I have a feeling that what we're going to do eventually is to forget about this funny notion that we've carried over into the recording of music strictly as a legacy, and a very poor one, of the concert hall. And that is that we should sit the listener down in front of his stereo speakers and confront him box-like with an experience. I don't think that we're supposed to confront him with anything at all, and I think that one way in which that can be broken through is to think in terms of multiple perspectives which represent and which choreograph and which set forth the work as clearly and as analytically as we can. I mean, precisely in the way in which a film track would have multiple perspectives applied to it, you know, to represent the kind of situation it was, the horse leaning over and kissing the girl from the farm next door, that kind of scene, as against the intimate chat by the Bonanza fireplace, that kind of scene. You know, nobody's ever thought of doing this to music, except in relation to one symphony as against the next symphony, maybe. In that way, you could convey precisely what the emotion of that piece, just as an animator could convey it to you, was all about, you know. You wouldn't violate the music. There would be no sense of violating the music. What you would violate is the ridiculous, too long-held perspective of the concert hall, which has kept us going and in business for a long time, but shouldn't have.
What on the concert platform do you recall as among the most frantic, instant processes of Bach decision-making?
The ones that I couldn't remember.
I think at that point, all of us are ready for a concert experience via this medium, and you to give it.
I feel challenged.
An ad agency art director begins to get the message that he's not quite with it Sunday night on the day they killed the snowman. At work, his ideas are rejected, while at home, his wife and long-haired son treat him with open hostility. Watch The Day They Killed the Snowman, starring Michael Caine, Sunday night in color. 1 week from tonight, watch the first of 2 extraordinary specials filmed in Africa. Journey deep into the heart of this huge continent and see Wild Africa as it was next Wednesday night at 9:30. This is the CBC Television Network.